A decanter lies in pieces. Was it an accident, or a silent scream for help? Welcome to Newt's Criminals. I am your host Elio. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? Your messages always bring this community to life. Let's begin. The sun was shining over the village of Lower Bindford with the warm, golden insistence of an early June afternoon, casting long leafy shadows across the sprawling lawns of the Bramley estate. Mrs. Lavinia Bramley, recently widowed but determinedly sociable, was hosting her annual garden party with all the pomp her household could muster. Crystal jugs of lemonade sweated in the heat beside plates of cucumber sandwiches and Victoria sponge. The silver service gleamed. Laughter and the clink of tea cups filled the air like the pleasant hum of bees. Miss Marple, dressed in pale lavender and seated unobtrusively near a rose trellis, sipped her tea with mild interest. Her blue eyes, sharp behind a delicate lace-trimmed hat, moved not with haste but with purpose, quietly cataloguing each detail of the gathering. She watched as the vicar's wife fluttered past, trailed by her overeager fox terrier, and noted the way young Georgina Carlyle exchanged a glance, a brief one, sharp as a thorn, with Mr. Hugh Eastman, the late Mr. Bramley's solicitor. There was no gossip in Miss Marple's expression, only quiet consideration. Human nature, she often said, was rather like embroidery, all neat and pleasant on the surface, but quite a tangle behind. As the guests mingled, the pleasant murmur of conversation was broken by the sound of glass shattering. A hush swept over the lawn like a sudden gust of wind. All heads turned toward the drawing-room's open French doors. A servant appeared, pale and breathless. "There's been an accident," she stammered. "In the study." People surged forward, but Mrs. Bramley's voice cut through the crowd. "No one is going inside." Her tone was high and brittle, her usual poise fraying. Please wait here." But it was too late. Colonel Redford, retired and ever officious, had already pushed his way into the house. Within moments, he returned, his ruddy complexion several shades paler. "It's Hugh Eastman," he announced gravely. "Dead. In the study. His head's been struck. God help us with a decanter. The one from the mantelpiece. Shattered to bits." A collective gasp rippled through the guests. Miss Marple remained seated. Her tea sat cooling on the table beside her, forgotten. She folded her hands over her handbag and said, more to herself than anyone else, "How very curious. That decanter was a wedding gift, I believe. Cut the crystal very finely. Quite sentimental to Lavinia. No one paid her any attention." Which, of course, suited Miss Marple just fine. "Word travels quickly in villages, faster," Miss Marple often said, "than telegrams or telephones ever could," and by that evening, the news of Hugh Eastman's sudden and violent death had spread through Lower Bindford like a grass fire in a summer wind. Though the garden party had dissolved in chaos, with guests ushered out gently but firmly by Inspector Graves and his young constable, the gossip began before the last teacup had been cleared from the lawn. By 8 o'clock, every drawing-room and parlor from the postmaster's cottage to the manor on Bindford Hill was alive with speculation. In the sitting-room of the Wheatsheaf, the village's lone pub and social hub, after dark the atmosphere was unusually sober for a Tuesday evening. Pints remained untouched as patrons leaned in to exchange hushed theories with theatrical whispers. "I'll tell you who's behind it," muttered Tom Ellison, the butcher, nursing a pint and a red face. "It's that gardener. The young one, Peter, I think. He was let go just last week. I caught nicking wine from the cellar, I heard. Had a row with Mr. Eastman right before he got the sack. You always blame the help, Tom, snapped Mildred Barstow from her perch by the fire. She was the postmistress and proud of her position as the unofficial gatekeeper of village information. But I've heard from Mrs. Potter's niece who works part-time at the Bramley place that Mr. Eastman and Lavinia were having a disagreement. Loud, it was. Just yesterday. From the corner, Reverend Chillingham cleared his throat disapprovingly. We mustn't jump to conclusions. Let the police do their work. They're already here, poking about, said Tom, waving his hand. Though between you and me, Inspector Graves is a bit too eager to look clever. Still, murmured Mrs. Barstow, a decanter, of all things. Most improper. You'd think a man like Mr. Eastman would meet his end with a ledger in his hand, not a bit of broken glass. Not far away, in the neatly kept parlor of her cottage on Church Lane, Miss Marple sat by the fire, clicking her knitting needles with the gentle patience of someone who had seen many things and forgotten none. Her guest, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Amelia Chillingham, was halfway through her second cup of chamomile and had grown more animated with every sip. It's just all so shocking, Jane, she said, adjusting the hem of her skirt. To think murdered. And right there in the Bramleys' own study. I passed by that room not half an hour before it happened. Hugh looked quite flushed. I suppose he had a reason. Miss Marple looked up mildly. Oh. Yes, indeed. I couldn't help but overhear. Well, it was hard not to hear. Hugh and Lavinia were in the corridor, having a rather tense conversation. Something about money, I believe. Hugh sounded very firm. Lavinia, well, she rarely loses her composure, but she looked frightfully pale. How curious, Miss Marple murmured, finishing her row. Amelia leaned in. Of course, I shouldn't say such things. But you must wonder, Jane. What sort of person would strike another with a heavy crystal decanter? That sort of thing isn't done in the heat of passion. It takes force. And intent. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed, setting her needles aside. And intent is always the more interesting half of the puzzle, isn't it? Opportunity is simple to observe. But motive often wears a very different dress. Outside, the night had settled fully over Lower Bindford, shrouding its cottages and cobbled lanes in thick shadow. The moon hung low and pale, casting elongated silhouettes across the hedgerows. From the manor house, the faint hum of police voices carried faintly on the breeze as Inspector Graves and Constable Reed moved from room to room, their footsteps muffled by plush carpeting and old wood. In the study, where the crime had occurred, the air was heavy with stale brandy and old furniture polish. The shattered remains of the decanter had been carefully bagged and removed, but a dark stain still marked the edge of the Persian rug where Hugh Eastman had fallen. Inspector Graves rubbed his chin thoughtfully. He was a square-shouldered man with a fondness for structure and quick conclusions. To him, the case was nearly closed. Let's be practical, Reed, he said, scanning his notes. Eastman was Lavinia Bramley's solicitor. Handled her affairs since her husband died. If there was trouble between them over a dispute over the estate, perhaps that gives her motive. And the weapon? One of her own possessions. That suggests something impulsive, personal. Not premeditated, but not random either. Constable Reed, fresh-faced and a touch hesitant, nodded slowly. She didn't seem surprised, sir. Not distraught. Exactly. Controlled. Too controlled. In another room, Lavinia Bramley sat in silence. The drawing room, usually adorned with music and laughter, felt unusually still. She had declined further questioning for the night and now sat beside the cold fireplace, her hands resting gently on her lap, a decanterless mantle behind her. She stared into the empty hearth, her face pale but composed. Her brother, Julian, a quiet man with thinning hair and eyes like water, hovered nearby with a drink in hand, though he'd not taken a sip. "Do you think they suspect you?" he asked quietly. Lavinia didn't look up. "I imagine they suspect everyone. That is their job." Julian shifted uneasily. "You and Hugh were close. People may talk." "People will talk, regardless of facts," she replied. "But facts matter more. Especially to someone like Jane Marple." That name lingered in the air like a distant chime. Meanwhile, in her own home, Miss Marple pulled out a small notepad from the drawer of her writing desk. She never took formal notes when she didn't have to, but sometimes a name, a connection, or a peculiarity demanded preservation before time could wear it thin. She wrote Hugh Eastman, solicitor known for discretion. Lavinia Bramley widow conversation overheard. Peter Gardner? Recently dismissed. Decanter sentimental value visible on the mantel. Why move to study alone during a garden party? She paused, tapping the pencil against her cheek. It was not the presence of the broken decanter that puzzled her but rather its placement. The study, after all, was somewhat removed from the garden party. A quiet corner of the house. Not the sort of place one stumbles into without intention. And yet, someone had done just that. As she closed her notebook, Miss Marple let her mind drift not to the crime itself, but to the people surrounding it. That, she believed, was always the proper way. One never solved a mystery by looking at the scene, one solved it by understanding who had walked across it, and why. She turned out the light and prepared for bed. The night was long, and morning, no doubt, would bring fresh theories. But Miss Marple, even at rest, would be thinking. And somewhere in the village, the truth, quiet and watchful, waited to be found. The morning after the garden party dawned hazy and cool, with a grey veil of mist clinging to the hedgerows and curling lazily around the stone chimneys of Lower Bindford. By 8:30, Inspector Graves had already returned to the Bramley residence with renewed energy and a growing conviction that the case was moving toward a swift resolution. As he paced the study, freshly tidied but still bearing the somber air of recent death, he reviewed his notes again, searching not for new details but for confirmation of his theory. To Graves, the matter was straightforward. Hugh Eastman had been struck down during a brief, emotionally charged confrontation. The shattered decanter, a weighty object made of thick cut glass, had fractured against his skull, killing him instantly. There was no sign of forced entry, no theft, no struggle. The motive, he believed, was emotionally personal, and the list of people who had access to the study during the garden party was mercifully short. Only a handful could have slipped away unnoticed, he muttered aloud, glancing at Constable Reed, who stood beside the window, scribbling furiously. "Who are they, sir?" asked Reed, eager to keep up. Graves ticked the names off on his fingers. "Mrs. Lavinia Bramley, obviously. She lives here, and knows the house inside out. Her brother was seen going in and out throughout the afternoon, claiming to be fetching papers. Then there's Miss Georgina Carlyle. Young, impetuous, had a strange look on her face when she heard the news." He paused. "And Peter Goswick. The gardener. Recently dismissed for petty theft, reportedly angry. There's a motive there if you know where to look." Reed hesitated. "Do you believe Mrs. Bramley is capable of such a thing?" Graves raised an eyebrow. "Everyone is capable under the right pressure, Reed. Never assume the gentlest manner can't conceal the most dangerous thoughts. You'll learn that." Reed nodded slowly, though his eyes drifted toward the study's wide window, which overlooked the neatly trimmed back garden. From there, one could just see the rose trellis and the edge of the lawn where the party had taken place. A strange place for a murder, he thought. Too open, too exposed, and yet no one had seen or heard a thing. Across the village, Miss Marple took her breakfast in her usual manner: a soft-boiled egg, a slice of buttered toast, and a small pot of Darjeeling. She listened quietly to the morning birdsong through the open window while the Times lay folded beside her plate, unread. She had received a visit not an hour earlier from Mrs. Barstow, who arrived under the innocent pretense of delivering a jar of gooseberry jam but had wasted no time in recounting the latest village chatter. Apparently Julian Bramley went straight into the drawing-room before the police even arrived, Mrs. Barstow had said, eyes gleaming. Said he was fetching smelling salts for his sister. But how odd, don't you think, Jane, that a man would know exactly where such things are kept in a lady's cabinet? Miss Marple, spooning her egg with neat precision, had merely said, "It depends, I suppose, on how often he visits." Familiarity reveals itself in the most curious ways. Now, as she rinsed her teacup and tied on her gardening gloves, Miss Marple was thinking not about Julian, but about Miss Georgina Carlyle. Georgina, niece to Lavinia Bramley, had always struck Miss Marple as a girl with more ambition than discretion. Pretty in a haughty sort of way, and possessed of a sharp tongue rarely softened by tact. That afternoon, as the sun broke through the mist and dried the dew on the garden paths, Miss Marple strolled toward the churchyard, her basket on her arm. As she approached the low stone wall, she spotted Georgina herself kneeling beside the flower-beds, cutting back the overgrowth of irises that bloomed near her mother's grave. Such a peaceful spot, Miss Marple observed gently as she neared. "Your mother always liked the view of the bell tower, didn't she?" Georgina glanced up, surprised, then rose to brush the dirt from her gloves. Her tone was polite but cautious. "Yes, she did. Though I think she'd be rather cross with how overgrown things have become." Miss Marple smiled. "Time gets away from all of us, dear. I was just admiring your technique with the shears. Precise. You must be quite used to them." Georgina looked puzzled. "I suppose I am. I help the vicar's wife with the church flowers now and again." "Very good of you," Miss Marple said, then added with deliberate lightness, "and such a busy time of year to what with your aunt hosting that lovely garden party. I do hope you enjoyed yourself, before the unpleasantness." Georgina's expression flickered. "It was fine. Though honestly, I was rather bored before it all happened. I was just thinking of slipping away for a walk when the news came." So many people coming and going, it must have been difficult to keep track." Georgina gave a noncommittal shrug. "I suppose. But I really didn't see anything." Aunt Lavinia was chatting with Reverend Chillingham, and Uncle Julian was fiddling with that ridiculous phonograph. Mr. Eastman must have gone inside alone. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unreadable. "Yes, quite alone." Later that day, Inspector Graves made his way to the cottage of Peter Goswick. The small house, tucked behind the greengrocer's, was in poor repair. A rake leaned against the porch. The curtains were drawn, and a worn bicycle rested against the gate. Peter himself answered the door in shirt-sleeves, his hands still smudged with soil. "Inspector," he said cautiously. "Didn't expect to see you." "I imagine not. Mind if I come in, Mr. Goswick?" The interior was spare, a table littered with gardening magazines and a half-empty mug of tea. Peter offered no pleasantries. He was a lean young man, no more than 24, with sun-weathered skin and eyes too old for his years. "You were dismissed by Mrs. Bramley last week," Graves began. "Care to tell me why?" Peter's jaw tightened. "For taking a bottle of wine. Not even a full one. I didn't steal it, I just borrowed it. It was hot, I'd been working all morning. And Mr. Eastman made a scene of it." "Was he alone when he confronted you?" "Mostly. Julian Bramley came in halfway through and stood there like he was enjoying the show. Didn't say a word." Graves studied the man. "Did you see Mr. Eastman yesterday?" Peter shook his head. "No. I stayed away. I knew I'd only make things worse. I had no reason to go back to the house." "But you had a motive." "Resentment." Peter looked him square in the eye. "Maybe. But I've got more sense than that." Graves left without further comment, though doubt lingered. Back at the station, he compiled his notes, irritation simmering beneath the surface. Too many people with reasons, too few with proof. That evening, Miss Marple took a quiet walk through the village, her shawl wrapped neatly around her shoulders. The summer air had grown cool again, and the glow of gas lamps lit the streets with golden pools of light. As she passed the vicarage, she caught a glimpse of Julian Bramley standing alone in the garden, smoking. She paused at the gate and gave him a warm smile. "Evening, Mr. Bramley. A thoughtful hour, isn't it?" Julian nodded curtly. "It's hard to sleep these nights." Miss Marple studied him with interest. "I imagine it must be difficult, losing a friend in such a dreadful way. Especially one you worked with so closely." Julian didn't reply at once. He flicked ash into the flower bed. "I suppose so." "Well," Miss Marple said kindly, "one must trust that the truth has a way of revealing itself. Even in the quietest places." She gave a polite nod and walked on. Julian remained in place, the smoke curling past his face, his expression unreadable. And far away, in the recesses of Miss Marple's mind, a pattern had begun to form, not of facts and timelines, but of glances, words unsaid, and quiet contradictions. She did not yet know the full shape of the truth. But she knew it was waiting to be found. The next morning broke clear and still over Lower Bindford, the kind of summer day that seemed to encourage calm, though there was anything but calm in the minds of its residents. The village, normally lulled by routine and the comforting predictability of domestic chores and gardening schedules, was buzzing with quiet tension. A murder, especially one committed within the drawing-room of the most refined household in town, had unsettled the rhythms of everyday life. Inspector Graves sat stiffly at the corner table in the wheat sheaf, nursing a lukewarm coffee while reviewing his latest report. Beside him, Constable Reed waited expectantly, notebook at the ready. "Time to move forward," Graves said at last. "We can't afford to let this drag on. The press is already nosing about, and I've no interest in having London think we're fumbling. The longer this simmers, the more room there is for speculation." Reed looked up. "You're ready to make an arrest?" Graves gave a sharp nod. "All signs point to Lavinia Bramley. She had access, motive, and opportunity. The altercation overheard by the vicar's wife was a clear indication of tension." Financial documents found in Eastman's satchel show inconsistencies in Mr. Bramley's estate: missing funds, questionable withdrawals. Eastman might have confronted her about it. Reed hesitated. But do you think she's not the violent sort. Graves scoffed quietly. Violence doesn't always come with bared teeth and raised voices, Reed. Sometimes it wears pearls and offers you tea. She was alone in the house more than once that afternoon. She knew the study well. She had reason to silence Eastman. The decanter sentimental, yes, but within reach. And she didn't scream when the body was found. Reed looked uneasy, his pencil hovering midair. But what about Peter Goswick? He had more open resentment. An undisciplined young man with a grievance. Not calculated enough for this. The murder wasn't a brawl, it was precise. One blow. No mess. Goswick's more the temper type. This was something different. Cold. Decisive. Across the village, in her well-kept cottage, Miss Marple watered the fuchsias hanging beneath her front window. Her movements were slow and thoughtful. The village was always quick to place blame, she knew, especially when the target was someone like Lavinia Bramley. Wealthy, widowed, composed, qualities that bred both admiration and quiet resentment. She was expecting a visitor, and right on time, the bell rang. It was Georgina Carlyle, clutching a folded cardigan and looking slightly out of sorts. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said as Miss Marple led her into the sitting room. "Not at all, dear," Miss Marple replied gently. "I was hoping we might have a little chat." "Do sit down." Georgina perched on the edge of the armchair. She glanced about the room, the delicate lace curtains, the porcelain knickknacks, the soft ticking of the mantel clock before sighing. "I can't stand the way people are whispering about Aunt Lavinia. As though she could ever do something like that." "Then you don't believe she's guilty?" Miss Marple asked lightly. "Of course not. It's ridiculous. She might be strict about money and keeping things in order, but murder? That's absurd." "She did have a quarrel with Mr. Eastman," Miss Marple said, watching her carefully. "I know," Georgina said. "I overheard it. But it wasn't what people think. Hugh was warning her. About Julian." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Georgina continued, her voice dropping. "He said something about Julian using the estate funds, withdrawing money behind Aunt Lavinia's back. He said it had to stop. Aunt was furious, but not Hugh at Julian. She didn't want a scandal." "Did Julian know that Hugh was going to confront her?" Georgina hesitated. "I think so. I saw them talking just before the party. It wasn't friendly." Miss Marple gave a slight nod, her expression thoughtful. "Do you mind if I ask where you were when the murder occurred?" Georgina flushed faintly. "I was on the terrace, behind the house. I wanted some air. There were too many people." "No one with you?" "No. I like to be alone sometimes." "Is that suspicious?" "Not at all," Miss Marple said kindly. "It's just helpful to understand the patterns of the day." Georgina stood. "Well, I hope the inspector finds the truth. For Aunt Lavinia's sake." As the girl left, Miss Marple sat back and reached for her knitting. The needles clicked softly as she considered the many faces of the afternoon: Julian's tight-lipped presence, Lavinia's composed exterior, Georgina's volatile certainty. She thought again of the study, of the decanter. A sentimental object, yes, but also heavy, breakable, and close at hand. At the Bramley estate, Inspector Graves returned that same afternoon. Lavinia was seated by the piano, her gloved hands resting neatly in her lap. "You have more questions, Inspector?" she asked calmly. "Just one," Graves said. "Where were you during the 15 minutes leading up to Mr. Eastman's death?" Lavinia did not blink. "I was in the dining room, overseeing the tea service. Mrs. Chillingham can confirm that. She said she saw you briefly. Not for the full time. Then perhaps she missed me stepping out. I went to check the linen stock for the footmen. That room adjoins the kitchen." Graves paused, noting it down. "Why didn't you mention it before?" "Because I didn't realize I was on trial," Lavinia said smoothly. "Do you believe I'm guilty, Inspector?" Graves didn't answer. Instead, he gestured to the side table. "This decanter's the matching one to the one used in the attack. You didn't mention it was a gift from your late husband. Why would I? It's hardly relevant. It's always relevant when sentiment meets violence." "I keep it because it reminds me of him," Lavinia replied coolly. "Not because I intended to bludgeon someone with it." Julian entered then, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Is this interrogation nearly over? My sister has had a trying week." Graves turned to him. "Do you know why Mr. Eastman was looking into your financial records, Mr. Bramley?" Julian stiffened. "No idea. You'd have to ask him. Though I imagine that's impossible now." Graves narrowed his eyes. "You didn't like him?" Julian gave a small smile. "No. But dislike isn't murder." Back in her cottage, Miss Marple added new notes to her small notebook. Georgina Terrace alone overheard confrontation. Julian evasive financial motive? Lavinia is not shocked but protective. Two decanters sentimental pairs. Study far from the party. Not random. She paused, then underlined the final entry. Not random. Something was beginning to sharpen in her mind. Not a name, not yet, but a method. A rhythm. A thread of behavior hidden beneath the clamor of accusation. The village, for all its charm and chatter, was circling the wrong shadow. She could feel it. And when people looked in the wrong direction, the true danger always moved quietly through the open door. The case was still young, but the mask was beginning to slip. And Miss Marple, quietly watching, was waiting for the next tremor that would shake the whole picture free. The weather turned on Thursday morning, as though the sky itself had grown suspicious of the village below. Clouds gathered thick over Lower Bindford, casting a dull grayness across the lanes and gardens. The first murmurs of thunder sounded by late morning, and a soft drizzle followed, washing the dust from rose petals and leaving puddles along the footpaths. But inside the walls of the Bramley estate, the storm had already settled in. Inspector Graves returned just after 10 o'clock, accompanied by Constable Reed and two plainclothes men from the county. He was not there to ask questions, not this time, but to serve notice of formal suspicion. Mrs. Lavinia Bramley was to remain within the village until the investigation concluded. Her estate was to be searched thoroughly, and the contents of her husband's financial records examined anew. Miss Marple, observing the commotion from beneath a large umbrella as she walked her customary route past the gates, paused only long enough to see Julian Bramley storm from the front door, coat unbuttoned, muttering something foul about the inspector's provincial arrogance. Later, over tea with Mrs. Chillingham, Miss Marple said, "It is a curious thing, Amelia. I've always found it odd how some people react to tragedy with silence, and others with noise. Grief shows itself in different costumes, doesn't it? Mrs. Chillingham, who was known to find comfort in sharing things told to her in strictest confidence, leaned forward with the excitement of fresh knowledge. Well, Jane, Lavinia's solicitor wasn't just managing her estate. He'd recently added her to another set of trusts, ones she inherited from an uncle in Devon. Quite a tidy sum, from what I gather. And Julian didn't have access to it. Hugh Eastman was quite firm on that point. Miss Marple's expression hardly changed, but her fingers paused around her teacup. Really, she said softly. And how recently was this arranged? About a fortnight ago. Georgina told me. She overheard a telephone conversation. Apparently Hugh said something like, "You mustn't let sentiment muddy financial sense." Very particular words. Yes, Miss Marple murmured. He was particular. Solicitors are. It's the nature of the profession. That afternoon, the rain passed, leaving the village glistening and clean. The damp smell of turned earth and wet leaves drifted in through open windows, and Miss Marple took the opportunity to visit the study at the Bramley house. She had asked Lavinia if she might come by, under the pretense of borrowing a book once mentioned in a conversation weeks before. Lavinia, ever composed, obliged with the sort of grace born from generations of hostessing. "Of course, Miss Marple," she said, ushering her into the drawing-room. "Though I'm afraid the library is still in a state of disrepair. The police left it quite disordered." "That won't bother me," Miss Marple said, her tone cheerful. "Disorder is merely evidence of a mind in motion." She was left alone in the study shortly thereafter. The room had the stillness of a place that had not yet quite recovered from being the site of death. The bookshelves, tall and lined with leather volumes, loomed solemnly over the desk and the fireplace. There was a faint smell of brandy, of tobacco, and still lingering beneath it all something metallic, something that memory supplied rather than scent. Miss Marple walked slowly, her hand trailing the edge of the writing desk, her eyes scanning the surfaces without touching anything. The empty spot on the mantel, where the shattered decanter had once stood, drew her attention first. Then, across the room, she noticed something odd, a deep scratch along the skirting board beneath the low window. Barely visible. It caught the light only when she moved. She bent to examine it. A mark made by something sharp and hard and deliberate. Not an accident, and not recent either. "Curious," she murmured. She stood again and moved toward the bureau. A stack of documents, now neatly reordered, sat beside a brass letter opener and an ink blotter. She recognized Hugh Eastman's handwriting, tidy, rigid, with a fondness for underlining. But one paper, folded at an angle and partially obscured beneath the others, was different. It was a personal letter. Unsealed. Addressed to Julian Bramley. Miss Marple hesitated. She did not unfold it. She merely noted the name Julian and the faint blot on the corner of the page. Red ink. The same color as the dried residue near the broken glass, according to Mrs. Barstow, who had, by some miracle of timing, walked past the study windows the morning after and claimed to have seen it before the constable arrived. Miss Marple made no immediate connection. But she filed it away. That evening, while the village busied itself with increasingly dramatic theories, including one where Hugh Eastman had, somehow, faked his death for tax reasons, Miss Marple visited the vicarage once more. She asked a simple question. "Amelia, do you remember if the decanter was full when you last saw it on the mantel?" Mrs. Chillingham blinked. Oh, yes. Lavinia mentioned how heavy it was. She insisted the footman move it back into place after the study was dusted. I remember because he nearly dropped it. Must have been half full, at least. And that was the same day? Only an hour or so before the party began. Miss Marple nodded. Then it would have left quite a stain. A stain? Yes, said Miss Marple. If it had been used to strike someone, it would have shattered and spilled, wouldn't it? I suppose so. But there wasn't much on the rug at all. Said Miss Marple. The next morning, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to Peter Goswick. He met her in his small back garden, where he was planting marigolds with the concentration of a man seeking purpose in neat rows and turned soil. I was wondering, Miss Marple said, after exchanging polite greetings, did Mr. Eastman often walk the grounds during his visits? Peter looked up, puzzled. Sometimes. Usually after meetings with Mrs. Bramley. He liked the Rose Walk. Did he ever bring anything with him? Letters, now and then. His satchel. I think he just liked having somewhere quiet to read. Miss Marple smiled. Quite like me, then. She turned to go, but paused at the gate. Tell me, Peter, did you ever see Julian Bramley near the study window? Not inside, but outside? Peter frowned. Once. 2 days before the party. Looked like he was measuring something. Tape in his hand. Miss Marple's smile deepened, though it was not warm. Thank you, dear. You've been most helpful. That night, as the lamps flickered in the narrow lanes and the wind carried the scent of damp lilac, Miss Marple reviewed her notes once more. She made a fresh entry: study window scratch on skirting. Letter to Julian not sealed. Stain inconsistent, decanter not full. Julian is seen outside studying. Measuring. Why? She closed the notebook. There were questions still, yes, but more than that, there was one clue. Hidden, minor, but to Miss Marple's practiced eye, full of suggestion. The decanter had shattered, yes. But it had not bled as it should have. And that meant one of two things: either the murder weapon had not been the decanter at all, or someone had made it appear to be. And deception, Miss Marple knew, was always the shadow cast by guilt. The truth was not far away now. But it was still just out of reach. The wind picked up across Lower Bindford as Friday dawned, stirring the leaves and rattling shutters as if nature itself were trying to dislodge the secrets buried deep in its soil. Word had spread, as it always did, that Inspector Graves intended to announce an arrest before week's end. The villagers were divided, as villagers often are, between those convinced it was Lavinia Bramley and those firmly in the Peter Goswick camp. Miss Marple, however, remained unswayed by the noise. She had made her observations, collected her impressions, and now waited with the unshakable calm of someone who knew the truth was rarely loud. It lived instead in gestures, hesitations, and the little inconsistencies people left behind in their wake. At the Bramley estate, tension hung over the house like a low ceiling. Julian had taken to pacing the halls at odd hours, while Lavinia remained mostly in her room, emerging only for brief walks in the garden. Georgina Carlyle, on the other hand, had grown increasingly restless, slipping out for long walks and avoiding her aunt's direct gaze. On this particular morning, she stood in the morning room, staring out across the dewy lawn as Julian entered behind her. He was dressed more casually than usual, his tie askew, his eyes shadowed. You should go back to London, he said. Georgina didn't turn. I'm staying until this is finished. There's nothing you can do here. There's plenty I can do, she said. Starting with telling the truth. Julian stiffened. What is the truth? She turned to face him. You know what I mean. You were in the study that afternoon. That's absurd. No, it isn't. I saw you. You left through the side door, the one that opens toward the hedge. You looked back before you shut it. I thought it was odd, but now I know what I saw. Julian's expression froze, then shifted. A calm, practiced smile formed. You were mistaken. Easily done in the chaos of a garden party. Georgina's eyes narrowed. Don't patronize me, uncle. You forget I grew up watching you lie to creditors. You have a tell, you know. That little twitch of the mouth when you're cornered. Julian stepped closer. You're playing with fire, Georgina. So are you. He was about to speak when a knock at the door interrupted them. A servant appeared. Miss Marple to see you, sir. Julian composed himself quickly. Send her in. Miss Marple entered moments later, looking as unassuming as ever, wrapped in a soft mauve shawl and carrying a small parcel in hand. I hope I'm not intruding, she said with gentle politeness. Not at all, Julian said, his voice once again smooth. Always a pleasure. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Georgina, who stood rigid by the window, her arms crossed. I brought back the book Lavinia lent me, Miss Marple said. And, if I may, I have a question. Certainly, said Julian. I wonder if either of you knows whether Hugh Eastman had a habit of keeping duplicates of important papers. Georgina blinked, but Julian replied first. I doubt it. He was meticulous. Everything filed. Why do you ask? I came across something odd, said Miss Marple. One of the documents I saw in the study had a red ink blot in the corner. Rather unusual for Eastman, wouldn't you say? He preferred black ink, which is very traditional. Julian looked away for a moment. Georgina's expression, however, sharpened. What are you saying? I'm saying, Miss Marple continued gently, that it struck me as strange. The decanter used in the attack, or so we assume, didn't spill nearly the amount of liquid it should have. And there was no scent of brandy on Mr. Eastman's clothes when the doctor examined him. Very tidy, don't you think, for such a brutal blow? Julian smiled faintly. Perhaps it broke in such a way that most of the liquid soaked into the rug. Possible, said Miss Marple, though I must say it's very convenient. And rather inconsistent with Mrs. Chillingham's description of it being nearly half full just an hour earlier. There was silence. Then Georgina stepped forward. She's right. That rug was dry in places. I remember stepping around the shards when I saw the body. Julian turned to her sharply. You went into the room? Only for a moment. Miss Marple turned to Julian. And the letter addressed to you? The one found under the stack of documents? Julian raised an eyebrow. I've no idea what you mean. Miss Marple tilted her head. No? That's rather strange. It was quite visible. One would think it important, especially given the circumstances. Julian said nothing. His silence stretched just long enough to be damning. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a walk to the post office, where Mrs. Barstow greeted her with a mixture of curiosity and restrained reverence, the sort one offered to someone who always knew more than they said. "Busy day, Jane?" she asked. "Always something to think on," Miss Marple replied with a smile. "I heard the inspector narrowed things down." "Has he?" "They say he's to make an arrest tomorrow." "Most say it'll be Lavinia." Miss Marple nodded politely, then asked, "Have you handled much correspondence from Julian Bramley lately?" Mrs. Barstow looked intrigued. "2 letters last week. One registered. Went to an address in Eastbourne." "Interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "No mention of a solicitor's firm?" "No, just a personal address." "Could I trouble you to find the return address? The one on the envelope?" Mrs. Barstow raised an eyebrow. "I shouldn't, strictly speaking." "But you will," Miss Marple said gently. Minutes later, she walked away with the address written neatly on a slip of paper tucked into her handbag. It was a property management office of the kind that dealt with short-term lets and discrete tenancies. That evening, Inspector Graves received a note delivered by hand. It contained only a single line, written in Miss Marple's steady hand. It was never about rage. It was always about preparation. He read it twice and frowned. At the same time, Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting untouched in her lap. She was not yet ready to reveal the shape of the truth, but the edge of it had become clear. Someone had used the chaos of the party, the familiarity of the house, and the assumptions of everyone involved to mask a simple truth: the murder had not been an act of sudden passion. It had been planned, timed, even rehearsed. The killer had counted on distractions, on whispers, on people watching the wrong hands. And they had succeeded, for a time. But Miss Marple was watching, too. And where others saw a shattered decanter, she saw something else. A substitution. A misdirection. And a motive buried not in emotion but in quiet, deliberate desperation. Saturday morning dawned with an uneasy quiet over Lower Bindford. Though the sun returned and painted the hedgerows in golden light, the air was thick with expectation. Every villager from the vicar to the fishmonger knew something was coming. There had been too many whispers, too many visits from the inspector, and far too many sightings of Miss Marple walking, seemingly aimless, through the village lanes, her shawl gathered about her shoulders and her mind clearly elsewhere. At the Bramley estate, the atmosphere had grown strained beyond endurance. Lavinia remained mostly in her private quarters, issuing clipped instructions through the butler, while Julian paced the halls, his demeanor increasingly tight and irritable. Georgina, ever sharp-eyed, was seen leaving early in the morning with a handbag slung over her shoulder, striding toward the train station with an energy that suggested more than just a day trip. But she never boarded the train. Instead, she entered the post office, where she was observed by Mrs. Barstow, purchased a small bundle of envelopes, stamps, and a telegram from her hands shaking ever so slightly as she wrote. She left without a word, but not without being noticed. It was later that same morning when the second shock came. Constable Reed arrived breathless at the vicarage, where Inspector Graves had taken to interviewing the Reverend over a pot of weak tea. "Sir," Reed said, his cheeks flushed, "there's been a break-in. The Bramley estate. Someone's forced the lock to the study window." Graves stood at once. "Was anything taken?" "Not that we can tell," Reed said. "But there are fresh marks beneath the sill boot prints. And inside one of the desk drawers has been emptied." Graves didn't wait for more. Within 20 minutes, he was standing in the very study where Hugh Eastman had been found, this time examining the open drawer himself. The papers once kept their financial statements, handwritten notes, and a copy of Lavinia Bramley's revised trust documents had vanished. This wasn't amateur work, Graves muttered. They knew what they wanted. Knew where to look. Miss Marple arrived not long after, summoned by Georgina, who had returned to the house visibly shaken. "I don't know what's happening anymore," she confessed in a whisper as they sat together on a bench in the garden. "I thought I understood, but now it's worse. What if this was to cover up something new?" Miss Marple gave her a kind smile. "Crimes rarely happen in isolation, my dear. They follow a thread. A long one, usually. Once you find where it began, everything else begins to fall into place." Georgina nodded, but her eyes remained haunted. Inside the study, Graves questioned Lavinia again. She was seated, composed as always, though there was a distinct paleness to her features. "You've been through this room a dozen times, Inspector," she said coolly. "What is it you think you missed?" "I'm not looking for what I missed," Graves said. "I'm looking for what someone else thought we might have missed." Why would someone break into a room they already had access to? Lavinia raised an eyebrow. "Unless they didn't," she said softly. "Precisely," said Miss Marple, entering the room. She had moved quietly and now stood near the threshold, her hands folded before her. Graves gave her a curt nod. "Miss Marple. I couldn't help overhearing. You're quite right. This wasn't a spontaneous act. It was a calculated one. Someone returned not to steal, but to remove something. A risk only taken when the danger of it being found became greater than the danger of being caught." Graves looked at her, puzzled. "And what danger would that be?" Miss Marple approached the desk, looking down at the open drawer. "If I had to guess," she said, "I'd say whatever was in here directly implicated someone. Not just in financial wrongdoing, but in the murder itself." Lavinia's voice, calm but distant, drifted into the silence. Julian kept insisting there was no need for scrutiny. That everything was settled. I never believed him. But I thought it was simply pride. I never imagined she would stop herself, but not before a crack appeared in her composure. Outside, Georgina paced, her thoughts in disarray. She had not told Miss Marple everything yet. She hadn't mentioned the letter she'd found hidden in a hollow book in Julian's private sitting room. It had been unsigned but unmistakably Hugh Eastman's handwriting. A warning. "If you proceed with the transfer, I will have no choice but to inform Lavinia. You are risking not only her reputation but your freedom. This is your final notice." She had burned the letter in the fireplace that morning, unsure whether it was an act of protection or destruction. That night, as the village quieted, Miss Marple sat by her fire and opened her notebook once again. She reviewed each detail with care, drawing the threads tighter. Study breaking not theft, but erasure. Drawer financial records removed. Eastman's letter to Julian warning of fraud. Window scratch evidence of earlier entry. Boot prints consistent with male shoes. Georgina was frightened. Possibly withholding something. She paused, then added, was the murder staged to appear impulsive? Was the decanter swapped after the fact? The questions were no longer idle curiosities. Across the village, Julian sat in his private quarters, staring into the fireplace. His drink, untouched, rested on a table beside him. There was no one to impress now, no need to perform. His world, carefully constructed of half-truths and charm, was crumbling, and even he could sense it. A creak on the stair startled him. He turned, but no one appeared. He stood, crossed the room, and opened the door into the hallway. Empty. The candlelight flickered. Somewhere in the house, a hinge groaned. He closed the door again and locked it. In the morning, Inspector Graves would call for him. And Miss Marple, quiet and patient as ever, would be ready. She was no longer looking for the killer. She was waiting for him to reveal himself. Sunday morning arrived with a hush that felt unnatural, as if the very air of Lower Bindford were holding its breath. The church bells rang solemnly through the damp mist, but the pews were only half filled. Few had the appetite for scripture when so many truths still lay buried. Most villagers lingered by windows, watching the road toward the Bramley estate, half expecting the inspector's car to appear with handcuffs in tow. At Miss Marple's cottage, the mood was steady, as it always was. She took her tea, read a small passage from her prayer book, and selected a modest brooch for her lapel. Then she stepped outside with the quiet grace of someone with a task already decided. She did not walk toward the church. She walked toward the Bramleys. At the same moment, Inspector Graves was seated in the drawing-room of the estate, his expression lined with impatience. Julian Bramley had been summoned at 8:30, but he had not yet come down. Playing games, Graves muttered. The man's used to bluffing his way through bank meetings. I think this is more of the same. Constable Reed, seated by the window, nodded toward the front drive. Miss Marple, sir. Graves stood and straightened his coat, though why he always did so when she entered, he didn't know. Miss Marple. To what do we owe the pleasure? I've come, she said gently, to offer an idea. One that might encourage Mr. Bramley to join us, if he's reluctant. Graves raised an eyebrow. You intend to draw him out? I intend to ask a few questions, she said. But not to him. To Georgina. She and Julian have always been close, but I suspect she knows more than she said. Sometimes, truth isn't coaxed by force but by a carefully lit match. Graves gave a slow nod. Be my guest. Miss Marple was shown into the morning room, where Georgina sat by the window, legs drawn up beneath her like a child trying to disappear. You're very quiet today, Miss Marple observed, seating herself nearby. Georgina didn't respond. I've always believed, Miss Marple continued softly, that guilt can take many forms. Some people wear it loudly, boasting, bluffing. Others wear it like a stone in the pocket. A weight that changes how they walk. Georgina looked up. You think I'm guilty? No, Miss Marple said. But I think you've been holding something, haven't you? Something that doesn't belong to you. Georgina's lip trembled. I thought it would help. I didn't know what to do. Miss Marple waited. It was a letter. From Hugh. Hidden in one of the books in Uncle Julian's study. I found it 2 days before the party. I read it and I kept it. I was angry at Uncle. I thought maybe if I held on to it, I could stop whatever he was doing. Did you confront him? I hinted. But he was too clever. He said I'd misunderstood. That Hugh was being dramatic. And what did the letter say, exactly? It said Julian had moved money illegally. That he was planning to access funds through Lavinia's name. That Hugh would expose it. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And then? I hid the letter again. But after Hugh died, I panicked. I took it and burned it. I thought it made me look guilty. I didn't mean to protect Julian. But I didn't want to be accused either." Outside the door, Graves listened with grim satisfaction. But Miss Marple's tone remained calm. "You made a mistake," she said. "But you are not a murderer. However, Julian," she stood. "May I trouble you to ask your uncle to join us in the drawing room? I believe it's time he had a conversation with all of us." Georgina nodded and disappeared up the stairs. Minutes later, Julian entered the drawing room with the composure of a man walking into a meeting he expects to control. He nodded curtly to Graves and offered Miss Marple a faint, humorless smile. "To what do I owe the summons?" he asked, settling into the chair by the fire. "I believe it's time to put things in order," Miss Marple said. Graves stepped forward, arms crossed. "We've had a break-in," he said. "A staged one, we believe, meant to make it appear as if key documents were stolen by someone outside the household." Julian tilted his head. "How unfortunate." Miss Marple leaned in slightly. "And yet so convenient. You see, Mr. Bramley, there were very few people who would know exactly where Hugh Eastman kept his personal notes. And fewer still who would risk returning to the scene of the crime." Julian raised a hand, mocking its gentleness. "Miss Marple, surely you're not suggesting I'm a burglar as well as a suspect?" "I'm suggesting," she said quietly, "that you've orchestrated a deception. A rather tidy one, really. You knew Hugh had discovered your manipulation of the estate funds. You knew he intended to confront Lavinia. You also knew that, given his integrity, he would do so on the day of the garden party, the one day people would be distracted." Julian's jaw tightened. Miss Marple continued. "You arranged to meet him in the study. You struck him, but not with the decanter. With something else. Something heavy and narrow. A paperweight, perhaps. The decanter came after. To disguise the true weapon." "That's absurd," Julian snapped. "Is it?" Miss Marple's tone never changed. "You were seen outside the study window 2 days before. Measuring something. Preparing. You even scratched the skirting board in the process, proof that the window was opened and shut repeatedly." Graves stepped forward. "And the drawer?" "You returned after the murder to remove Eastman's file, the one with your forged signatures and evidence of the transfer. You staged the break-in to pin the blame on someone else. Perhaps even Georgina." Julian stood abruptly. "You have no proof." Miss Marple smiled, just a little. "But you forget you left a fingerprint on the interior sill of the window. A smear of red ink beside it. The same red ink found on the folded letter addressed to you. Red ink Hugh Eastman never used." Julian's face changed then. Not rage, but something worse, is the sudden absence of calculation. The moment when all options vanish. He turned to the inspector, hands shaking slightly. "She wasn't supposed to be there. Lavinia. She walked in just after he sat back down. It wasn't supposed to go that far." Miss Marple looked down at her hands. "Murder always goes further than intended, Mr. Bramley." Graves said nothing at first. He simply looked at Reed and gave a single nod. Constable Reed stepped forward. "Julian Bramley, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Hugh Eastman. You have the right to remain silent." The words faded into the background as Miss Marple turned and walked quietly from the room. Outside, the day had brightened. The mist had lifted, revealing the full green glory of the hedgerows and the trimmed garden paths. The wind had settled, the clouds gone. Miss Marple paused beneath the rose trellis. The decanter of the so-called weapon had never been the heart of the mystery. It had been the assumption. And assumptions, like old glass, could be shattered in a single stroke. By Sunday evening, the air in Lower Bindford was charged not with the heaviness of suspicion but with a kind of trembling anticipation. The churchyard, the green, the shops are all quiet. The villagers had taken to watching from behind curtains and porches, drawn to the invisible pull of finality. There had been no public announcement, but word always had a way of rippling through a village faster than even truth itself. Julian Bramley had been taken into custody. But not everyone understood how it had come to be. Not yet. In the vicarage sitting-room, a handful of villagers gathered around the hearth, murmuring amongst themselves. Mrs. Barstow had brought her embroidery. The Reverend Chillingham sat in his usual armchair, pipe clenched tightly in one hand. Mrs. Chillingham, never one to hide her enthusiasm for Miss Marple's insights, looked toward the front door every time it creaked. And eventually, it did. Miss Marple entered quietly, her shawl draped neatly across her shoulders, the mist clinging to her as though reluctant to let her go. "Jane," Amelia Chillingham said at once, half rising from her seat. "You've come." "We were just discussing Julian Bramley," added Mrs. Barstow, "and how strange it all is. He always struck me as slippery, but murder? I confess I didn't see it." Miss Marple sat down and removed her gloves, folding them carefully. "That's the trouble with murder," she said gently. "It rarely looks like murder at first. It often looks like a misstep, a quarrel gone too far, a moment of weakness. But underneath there is always something deeper." The room fell silent. Even the fire crackled more quietly. "I suppose," Reverend Chillingham said at last, "if anyone can explain it properly, Jane, it's you." Miss Marple offered a modest smile. "Well," she said, "perhaps I'll try. But not as a tale of deduction, really. More a tale of observation. Because that's what this was, you see, a matter of noticing things no one thought were important." She folded her hands and began. "It started, of course, with the decanter. A rather lovely one. Cut glass, sentimental value, proudly displayed. So when Mr. Eastman was found dead beside its shattered remains, the assumption quite naturally was that it had been the weapon. After all, it was broken. He was dead. It fit the picture. Or so it seemed." Mrs. Barstow leaned forward, eyes wide. "But it wasn't?" "No," said Miss Marple. "That was the first misdirection. The decanter was shattered after the fact to make the blow look like a crime of passion, a spontaneous attack during an argument. But the truth is, Hugh Eastman was struck with something else entirely. A narrow object, blunt but focused. The paperweight from the writing desk, I believe. He was killed instantly. The decanter was then dropped near the body, creating the illusion. And no one noticed?" asked the Reverend. "People noticed what they were meant to notice," said Miss Marple. "We were told it was the decanter, so we accepted that. But there were small inconsistencies. The stain on the rug, for example. For a decanter said to be half full of brandy, very little liquid was found. And there was no scent of alcohol on Mr. Eastman's clothing." Mrs. Chillingham gave a little gasp. "I didn't think of that." "Nor did most," said Miss Marple kindly. "But it bothered me. So I thought about who stood to gain from Mr. Eastman's death. Lavinia? No. She had nothing to hide. Her affairs were entirely above board. Peter Goswick? He had motive, perhaps, but not the temperament for such a carefully planned act. Georgina? She was frightened, yes, but not guilty. Then it was Julian all along, said Mrs. Barstow. Miss Marple nodded. Julian Bramley had motive, means, and knowledge. He had embezzled funds quietly and cleverly. Hugh Eastman, as Lavinia's solicitor, had discovered it. A letter from Hugh warned Julian to stop, or he would inform Lavinia. That letter, though burned by Georgina, had already served its purpose. Julian knew his time was short. So he planned. She looked around the room, her voice even. He prepared the study in advance. He tested the window and scratched the skirting board in the process. He measured the ledge, perhaps for an escape. And then, on the day of the party, with the house full and everyone distracted, he lured Hugh into the study. Likely under the pretense of reviewing documents. Reed, who had entered silently behind her, added, "We believe the weapon was removed and disposed of through the study window." That's where the boot prints came in. He re-entered later that night to remove Hugh's file. The staged breaking was just that, staged. Exactly, said Miss Marple. He needed to make it seem as though an outsider had taken what might have exposed him. But by then, the lie had begun to unravel. Julian underestimated the people around him. He thought Georgina too naive, Lavinia too cold, and the inspector too focused on the obvious. "And you, Jane?" asked Mrs. Chillingham. "Did he underestimate you as well?" "Oh, certainly," said Miss Marple, with a small smile. "But that's quite all right. It's often the best place to be underestimated. People speak more freely, show more of themselves. I merely watched. The ink blot on the letter, the inconsistency in the brandy, the scratch by the window, and Georgina's fear, all of it came together." "Then he confessed?" asked the Reverend. "Eventually," said Miss Marple. "Not in so many words. But his silence, his reactions, his presence at the crime scene, it all became too heavy. He folded under the weight of it. And the inspector, to his credit, saw it too." Graves, now standing quietly by the fireplace, gave a slight nod. "Miss Marple was ahead of all of us," he said. "As usual." The room was quiet for a long moment. The fire popped and hissed. Then Mrs. Barstow spoke. "So it's over, then. Properly over." Miss Marple looked down at her hands. "Yes. But it doesn't leave everything as it was." Mrs. Chillingham nodded. "It never does." Outside, the sky had turned the soft lavender of the approaching evening. Villagers stepped out from their cottages and moved slowly along the lanes, their conversation subdued, their steps more thoughtful than before. Lower Bindford had been reminded, as all villages occasionally are, that beneath the lace curtains and polished teapots, darkness could still find its way in. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat once more by the fire. Her knitting lay idle in her lap. She wasn't thinking about Hugh Eastman or even Julian Bramley. She was thinking, as she always did in the aftermath of these things, about people. How much they reveal when they believe no one is looking. How love and envy and desperation all wear similar faces, if you know how to see. And how, no matter how peaceful the village may seem, the truth is always waiting quietly, patiently for someone to notice. The following week unfolded with a gentle inevitability, like a sigh after a long-held breath. The village of Lower Bindford returned to its daily rhythms, though the pace felt altered, as though the machinery of its quiet existence had been ever so slightly wound tighter. The milkman resumed his morning rounds, the vicar resumed his sermons, and the wheat sheaf filled once more with the clink of pint glasses and the hum of speculative chatter. But something had shifted beneath the surface. Julian Bramley's arrest had not caused the scandal that some feared, nor the satisfaction that others hoped. It landed with the dull weight of something tragic, a sharp echo dulled by its familiarity. People in villages like Lower Bindford understood, better than most, that betrayal rarely came from strangers. It came from brothers, uncles, neighbors. On Monday morning, Lavinia Bramley stood at the edge of her garden, the hem of her skirt brushing the desert grass as she looked out over the hedgerows. She had not cried in public, nor in private by all accounts, but her face bore the fine lines of something that had broken quietly and would not be mended. A few villagers had sent kind notes. A casserole or two had arrived on the doorstep, but no one called in person. They did not know what to say to a woman whose brother had murdered a man in her study. Georgina came out to join her, her boots crunching lightly on the gravel path. "He was always so calm," Georgina said, her voice low. "Always knew what to say. I suppose I thought he was untouchable." Lavinia didn't look at her. Most people who believe themselves untouchable are simply good at hiding the truth. Georgina hesitated, then asked, "Will you stay here?" "For now," Lavinia replied. "The house is quiet again." "That suits me." They stood together in silence for a while. The roses along the trellis had begun to bloom again, their petals untouched by the memory of what had happened not far from where they stood. Down the lane, Miss Marple took her customary walk. She moved slowly, not from infirmity but from thoughtfulness. She passed the post office misses. Barstow waved, her gossip now tempered with humility, and then paused near the churchyard. She knelt to inspect a clump of pale blue, forgot me near the edge of the path, and smiled to herself. Life, like flowers, had a way of returning to bloom even after the harshest frost. That afternoon, she received a visit. It was Inspector Graves. He stood on her front step, hat in hand, his manner slightly sheepish. "Forgive the intrusion, Miss Marple. I hoped I might impose on your time once more." "Of course," she said, stepping aside. "Do come in. The kettle's already on." Inside, they settled into the modest sitting room, the fire lit against the spring chill. Graves accepted his tea with gratitude. "I wanted to thank you," he began, "for your help. I may not have said it at the time, but your insight was essential." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Not insight, Inspector. Merely attention. I find most people tell you what you need to know, if you give them the room to do it." Graves nodded. "That, and your talent for spotting ink smudges and window scratches." "Well," she said with a twinkle in her eye, "details matter. They're how people reveal themselves without meaning to. The things we overlook are often the things that tell the story." Graves leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I still can't quite make sense of Julian. Why take that risk? Why not just run?" "Because he believed he could still win," Miss Marple replied. "He had lived so long deceiving others that he imagined he could deceive reality itself. But murder isn't a game. It changes the fabric of things. Once you've taken a life, you're no longer the man you thought you were. And reality has a way of catching up." Graves exhaled slowly. "Have you ever gotten used to it?" "To what?" "To see through people. To understand what most of us miss. Miss Marple looked at him with the calm of someone who had long made peace with the answer. It's not about getting used to it. It's about remembering that kindness and cruelty both leave their marks. One must simply learn to see both, and not flinch when they appear in the same person. They spoke no more of the case after that. Instead, they sat quietly, the fire crackling, the tea warm. Later, after he had gone, Miss Marple sat alone, the house settled around her in the stillness of early evening. She reached for her notebook one final time, turning to the back page. Case Hugh Eastman, cause of death blunt trauma, concealed motive financial Julian Bramley, method misdirection and substitution, weapon paperweight, presumed key clues dry rug, red ink letter to Julian, window scratch, false break-in. She paused. Then, beneath that, she wrote, truth often hides in what is made to seem obvious. The loudest story is rarely the true one. Satisfied, she closed the book. Outside her window, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the cobbled lane. The birds were beginning their evening songs, their melodies a gentle reassurance that life, despite everything, carried on. And so it did. At the vicarage, Mrs. Chillingham busied herself with supper preparations, relieved to speak of simpler things. At the Wheatsheaf, the patrons had begun to turn their attention back to football and weather. Even the post office had returned to the dependable clack and shuffle of stamps and parcels. Only the Bramley estate remained altered, quieter, yes, but still beautiful in the fading light. A house that had seen the worst of human intention, and still stood. Miss Marple rose to draw the curtains. As she looked out onto Church Lane one last time that evening, she felt no sense of triumph or victory. Only the quiet acknowledgement that another page had turned. Evil had been done. But it had also been seen. Uncovered. Named. And in that, there was peace. She turned off the lamp and went to bed, her heart steady, her mind still. And the mystery of the shattered decanter, like the decanter itself, was no longer broken, but finally put to rest.